Have you ever stopped to think about the word awakening? You've probably heard it over and over again, in debates, on social media, or even in casual comments, and maybe you've even formed a strong opinion about it. But here's the mystery. How many of us really know what it means? The word arouses all kinds of passions, and like a good joke, many misinterpret it. Comedian John C., a humorous genius who has made us laugh with his creativity in Monty Python, recently joined the conversation. His point of view, however, makes us question whether in our attempt to be fair and aware of injustices, we have lost sight of something fundamental. John C. takes us to the origin of the term awakening, which used to be limited to being alert to social injustices, especially racial injustices. But as this word has spread, its meaning has expanded to all kinds of sensitivities and offenses, and this is where C throws his first punch. In his view, the culture of awakening has reached a point where it needs something much deeper to justify its existence, an insatiable human need to be right. Think about it for a moment. How many times have we seen people fervently defend a cause that they can barely explain? It's not a new phenomenon, but the funny thing is that, as he points out, awakening is just another example of that human quirk, the desire to have the last word, even when you don't fully understand the subject. C does not limit itself to criticizing the misuse of the word. He watches with frustration as the awakening has infiltrated comedy, a space that he says should be a haven of freedom. If you've ever noticed that the mood seems to have changed, becoming less spontaneous, less daring, maybe you're catching what C is trying to tell us. In his opinion, comedy must explore the limits. It should make us laugh, sometimes even make us feel uncomfortable. Comedy, when it's authentic, isn't afraid to confront our insecurities or mistakes. But in a world where every word is dissected for offense, that magic is stolen from us. For C, irony is the lifeblood of humor. Understanding the context of a joke is essential, but when that subtlety is lost, laughter turns to annoyance and, eventually, indignation. The most curious thing is that, although many are easily offended, they are not necessarily defending their own wounds. John C. notices a strange phenomenon. People are often offended on behalf of others, of those who may not even be asking to be defended. Have you ever seen someone become indignant about a cause that is not theirs, adopting a savior tone? C. considers it condescending, as if these people assume that only they can understand the offenses of others. In his view, true respect is about allowing others to stand up for themselves if they need to, rather than seeking to feel morally superior through outrage that doesn't belong to them. C pauses and points to a new culprit in all this: the media. According to him, they have a decisive role in igniting the spark of indignation. As an intermediary between woke culture and the rest of us, they present statements out of context, increase the volume of the scandal, and before we know it, there are angry crowds about something that was never offensive in the first place. C cites a personal example. A comment of his, taken out of context, could appear in some media, giving a completely distorted image of his words. This manipulation of information transforms a simple comment into a controversy. Thus, we are reminded that, when the conversation is lost in the noise of absolute correctness, comedy and many other forms of expression also run the risk of disappearing. Although it may seem that C is against awakening, he himself recognizes something valuable in his essence. Who wants to be unfair to the vulnerable? Compassion is important, and C understands it. However, the problem is when that compassion becomes an expectation of censorship, when political correctness abandons its original meaning and becomes a tool to impose a single point of view. For C, comedy and freedom of expression should not suffer because of this. He wonders if we have reached the point where certain topics are considered untouchable, and if so, what is lost in the process? In an almost nostalgic moment, C remembers when it was common to joke about different nationalities, without anyone being offended to the point of wanting to cancel the comedian. In those days, everyone knew that the joke was in the context, in the shared laughter, and in the acceptance that comedy allowed us to make fun of differences without the intention of hurting. Today, he mentions a specific group, and tensions rise as if that act were a crime. Have we really lost the ability to laugh together? Is the culture of awakening the end of comedy as we knew it? These are questions without simple answers, but they are worth considering. Do you think woke culture has made us better, or has it simply created invisible barriers that keep us away from each other? Perhaps as you listen to John C., something resonates with you. You might remember a time when you laughed at a good joke between friends, one that broke the ice with something as simple as a cultural stereotype, an exaggeration about the way Australians talk, or about the Brits' taste for tea. No one was offended. It was just humor, something that helped connect across our differences. But in today's world, such a joke could be interpreted as disrespectful. For C, this is more than a loss of laughter. It is a sign that we are losing something important and essential, something he calls shared joy. Describes this cultural change with a mixture of irony and disillusionment. He tells how in his days as an emerging comedian, he could joke freely, even about topics that today many would consider taboo. It was common to make humor without fear of the consequences, and surprisingly, this did not generate resentment, but a sense of community. Through humor, people acknowledged their weaknesses, laughed at their stereotypes, and in the end, felt more united. Now, however, the fear of saying something wrong weighs on every word, like a cloud laden with tension. It is as if spontaneity itself is in danger of extinction. And here, the issue of cancel culture arises, a phenomenon that C considers one of the most toxic effects of modern sensibility. The idea that a comment, a joke, or a phrase taken out of context could lead someone to be publicly condemned is not only extreme, but also deeply damaging to freedom of expression. In an almost sarcastic tone, he mentions how a celebrity who doesn't follow the woke line to the letter risks facing public cancellation, and often disproportionately. The networks are flooded with criticism, the media amplify the echo, and in the end, a simple word or phrase becomes the ruin of a career. For C, this culture not only threatens comedians, but anyone who dares to think differently or simply laugh at something that is considered sensitive. C clearly points out the danger this poses to creativity and free thought. If every idea must pass through the filter of political correctness, at what point does creativity become an exercise in self-censorship? Comedy, he argues, is one of the few art forms in which risk is necessary. Making someone laugh implies an act of courage, of challenging the established, of using irony to show our own contradictions. And yet today, even the most innocent joke can end up being interpreted as an attack. What is lost then is not only the freedom of the comedian, but also the freedom of the viewer to laugh, to disconnect from the seriousness of the world, and to accept that life is full of ironies and absurdities. The underlying question is profound. Should we really adapt our culture to avoid offending the most sensitive? Or should we, as C proposes, learn to face our emotions and see comedy for what it is? For him, the fact that something offends us should not be a reason to limit the expression of others. In fact, he argues that the power of a free society lies in allowing everyone to express their ideas, however provocative, and in letting people react and reflect without seeking immediate punishment. The most paradoxical thing of all is that C is not entirely against the ideal of political correctness. He recognizes that the original impulse of awakening was, in essence, noble. Who could oppose a movement that seeks to protect the vulnerable? However, the problem, according to him, arises when this good intention becomes a witch hunt, a tool of control. When sensitivity becomes an imposed norm, authenticity and diversity of thought are crushed. And comedy, which has always been a haven for unfiltered expression, is at the center of this battle. C closes his reflection with a challenge. It invites us to question whether, in our modern society, we have reached a point where defending the freedom to laugh has become an act of resistance. For him, true freedom does not consist in living without being offended, but in being able to face the things that make us uncomfortable, in talking about them, and if necessary, laughing at them. In the end, it is about asking ourselves whether we want to live in a world where everything must be careful and safe, or in one where we can encounter, without fear, our own contradictions. So, while you're left with these questions, take a look at your own perspective. Are we happier protecting ourselves from every little offense, or are we losing something valuable in the process? As C suggests, perhaps it is time to rediscover the value of irony, the freedom to laugh, and, above all, to remind ourselves that life is too complex to be taken so seriously. S reflection extends to the very essence of what it means to be human. Because humor, in its purest essence, is an act of recognition, of observation of our own imperfections and absurdities. It allows us to see the ridiculous side of things that we would otherwise consider untouchable. And by laughing at ourselves and others, we build connections that overcome barriers, cultures, and beliefs. Today, however, that shared laughter seems to be increasingly limited, as if every joke is a minefield where every word must be carefully chosen. For C, the culture of awakening has created a dangerous paradox. On the one hand, it seeks a more just and compassionate society, but on the other, it imposes a control over language and thought that contradicts the very freedom it claims to defend. It is as if the search for justice has led to an extreme where speech and laughter are no longer free. Instead, we find a version of justice that, far from liberating, punishes, that is governed more by the fear of being misunderstood than by the desire to connect. And what does this mean for the next generation? C expresses concern that young people grow up in a world where expressing a different idea can be punished, where creativity is limited by the sensitivity of a few, and where laughter is monitored as if it were a crime. Imagine a future where comedians, artists, and writers are afraid to explore certain topics, to point out the contradictions of society, to talk about what they really think. For him, this future is a dark place, one in which freedom is sacrificed in the name of extreme sensibility, and in which comedy, one of the most powerful forms of art, is relegated to a role of superficial entertainment, incapable of challenging, uncomfortable, and thinking. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about CS Vision is that it is not limited to comedy. The culture of awakening and extreme sensitivity extends to other aspects of everyday life. In schools, on social media, in the workplace. Open conversation becomes a risk, and opinions are filtered before they are expressed. How then can we hope to build a strong and resilient society if every word must be carefully calculated to avoid hurting sensitivities? Isn't it in friction, in the clash of ideas, that we find our true growth? Ultimately, C presents us with a dilemma. Do we want a culture that protects everyone from any discomfort, even if it means sacrificing the freedom to express ourselves? Or do we prefer a society that, although it sometimes challenges and makes us uncomfortable, allows us to be ourselves, with all our contradictions and defects? For C, the answer is clear. A society that values freedom over comfort, that allows humor to be a reflection of our own weaknesses, and that celebrates laughter as an act of freedom. As his message sinks in, he invites us to remember that offense is an inevitable part of life, that perhaps true awakening is not about silencing what bothers us, but about learning to face those things with maturity and humor, and that perhaps true courage is not in avoiding being offended, but in finding the strength to laugh, to share, and to remember that, in the end, we are all on this journey together, stumbling, laughing, and learning. He closes his reflections with a warning and a reminder, one that resonates in the hearts of those who have felt the suffocation of a culture that limits and controls. Because, he says, if we let the fear of offending become the axis of our interactions, we run the risk of losing something essentially human, the right to fail, to make mistakes, to say things that may not be perfect, but that are born of a genuine attempt to understand and connect with others. In this context, comedy becomes the symbol of that freedom that escapes. Comedy, which has always been a haven for irreverent expression and uncomfortable truth, now finds itself at something of a cultural crossroads. For C, humor is not only an escape from reality, but a way of facing it in an honest way. Their voice becomes an echo of those who fear that authenticity will be lost in the battle to always be right. And herein lies his challenge. If we are willing to give up freedom in the name of apparent harmony, what kind of world are we building? A world in which every comment must be approved, in which every laugh must be measured, in which every thought must be filtered is not, according to him, a vibrant world full of life, but a desolate landscape, a place where creativity slowly dies, suffocated by self-censorship and the fear of making people uncomfortable. Through her words, C is not suggesting total insensitivity, nor that empathy and respect disappear from social dialogue. On the contrary, he insists that empathy is essential, but that it should not be confused with the need to control and restrict. Empathy for him does not mean censorship, but a sincere effort to understand others, even when we disagree with them. At the end of the day, empathy and respect should not restrict humor or creativity, but should enrich them, allowing people to express themselves freely, and that, through laughter, we can find common ground even in our differences. And this is where his message reaches its maximum impact. It reminds us that freedom of expression is not only a right, but a responsibility, one that requires courage to endure words and opinions that we may not like, to resist the temptation to censor what we do not understand or that makes us uncomfortable. Because in that resistance lies the true strength of an open and free society. According to C, the real challenge is not to eliminate what offends us, but to learn to live with it, to learn to debate without destroying, to laugh without fear, and to live without constant fear of the opinions of others. This is the legacy that C wants to leave, a passionate defense of the freedom to laugh, to question, to express oneself without restrictions. It invites us to reflect on the value of a society that, instead of seeking to protect everyone from all discomfort, fosters resilience, critical thinking, and true human connection. Because, as he rightly says, laughter is a universal language, one that transcends differences and has the power to unite us in our shared humanity. Thus, his final call is clear. Let us not let laughter be the victim of a culture that has forgotten the importance of freedom. Let us allow ourselves to fail, allow ourselves to laugh, and remember that sometimes, in the imperfect and the irreverent, we find the very essence of what it means to be alive.